And joining us now on the debate, Brian Shiller, legal counsel for the OSPCA. Liz White, director of the Animal Alliance of Canada. Hanna Booth, a shelter veterinarian formerly at the Toronto Humane Society. And Kate Hammer, reporter at the Globe and Mail, whose investigative reports broke the story at the Toronto Humane Society. And a reminder, this is a Your Agenda Thursday broadcast, so you can reach us via email at theagenda@tvo.org or on Twitter at twitter.com/theagenda. Okay, Kate, to you first. Since you broke this story, I wonder if you could start us off by just giving us the broad brushstrokes for those who might have missed it. What did you find out at the THS?
Well, I looked pretty squarely at the numbers at the Toronto Humane Society, in particular the number of animals that were being euthanized, and compared to the number of animals that were dying. The investigation found that there were about twice as many animals dying in their cages as there were being humanely euthanized. I spoke to dozens of employees, former staff, volunteers, current and former. Over and over again heard the same thing, that they're pleased to have an animal euthanized for being ignored by the management there, and the result was that animals were dying in their cages.
You wrote the piece. What was the reaction?
The reaction was pretty strong. What I've learned along the way is whenever you write about animal welfare, you're going to get a strong reaction. People love their pets. Right away there were protests actually outside the Toronto Humane Society shelter. There were a couple of those. There were appeals to the OSPCA, to the Public Guardian, to the CRA to investigate. It was the OSPCA, I think, pretty shortly, it was about 2 days after the first piece ran, that they announced that they were going to suspend the Toronto Humane Society's affiliate status and investigate on their own. And then I think about 3 days after when the series had completed, that's when they actually went in and did a full inspection of the facility.
So there was definite impact.
There was.
There was. Let's, Brian, I want to go to you on the Newmarket OSPCA story, but just before I do, I want to remind everybody that Mike Miner, our fifth column blogger, will be hosting an online chat. He's doing it right now on our website, tvo.org/theagenda. So while we have our conversation here in the studio, if you want to have one online, Mike is there to moderate, so please dial us up and participate. Okay, the other event happened last week, Newmarket, Ontario, the OSPCA. Run us through the events of that, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, starting sometime in February, there was an outbreak of ringworm at our Newmarket facility. It eventually got out of control. There were many steps taken to deal with the issue. We sanitized the facility over and over again, isolated animals, but the ringworm just kept on coming back, and it was a strain that surprised everybody.
Insofar as it was very virulent?
Yes. And in fact, the samples are still out for testing, and people are very interested to know precisely what this strain of ringworm is.
So you made a decision to?
Well, veterinarians made the decision that the only way to put an end to the ringworm epidemic in the facility was to euthanize all of the animals in the facility.
And that would have been what number? How many?
It would have been 350.
So you got about, what, 99 in?
99 animals were euthanized.
And at that point, what happened then?
Well, the veterinarians came back to us and they advised us that the remaining animals, a lot of them didn't show signs of ringworm. That didn't mean they didn't have it. And the decision was made to isolate the remaining animals, do further testing on them, get them into isolation in various facilities, and hope for the best. Was the thinking that the ringworm was so serious and causing the animals so much pain that it was in their better interests that they be put down? The thinking was that it was so difficult to treat because treating ringworm in a shelter environment is very difficult, and the strain was so severe it would have taken many weeks to months to rid the facility of ringworm. It wasn't that the animals were in a situation where they were going to die from the ringworm. It's a fungus. But in a shelter environment, you have to assess many factors, and one factor in particular is public health. Shelter staff were starting to get ringworm. They were taking it home with them. And obviously, if one of those pets had been adopted and taken it home, more potential. It's not an option to allow those animals to be adopted out with ringworm. Okay. Hanna, have there been other
examples in Canada of mass euthanization on this kind of a scale?
To be honest, I haven't followed. I would assume, I mean, Toronto any animal service is in the function of, I mean, if you don't have the space to be able to house the animals, and obviously in Canada we have a severe, in most countries we have severe animal overpopulation. So if you don't have the facilities to house the animals, there really isn't another option. I can't speak specifically on when other mass euthanasias have occurred.
I guess I'm trying to figure out here, the notion of putting down 350 animals, for whatever reason, in this case ringworm, is that extremely unusual in your business?
I would say that high of a number in one instance for a condition that is treatable, yes, it's unusual.
Okay. You're a vet who works in the shelters, right?
I am, yep.
How is that different from a vet who works in like a veterinarian clinic?
As a shelter vet, you're dealing with the overall population. So as much as shelter vets don't want to have to deal on a population base, and I mean, it's almost a herd health situation, like, you know, like dairy cattle or beef cattle. You want to be able to treat the individual animal, but you need to look at the overall population as a whole, and the overall greater good of the animal. And obviously, funds are usually limited in shelters, whereas in private practice, you've got, in most cases, clients that are willing to spend a lot of money on their animals.
Gotcha. Liz, where are you coming from on this?
Well, I think I talk to a lot of people in the community, that's where I come from, and we have, I think, organizations that are seen as two extremes. One that allegedly allows animals to die in their cages, and the other is too trigger happy with the needle. With a disease that is utterly treatable. And I think a lot of people reacted about the Newmarket situation because, frankly, the public relations process that occurred there was terrible. They could have gone to the community and said, look, we have this crisis. We need your help. We need to have our contracts set aside. We need veterinarians in the community to help us take the animals. We need to have veterinarians come in and help us. But we don't want to kill animals because of a treatable condition, and it doesn't have to happen. And I think that's why we saw the extent of anger in the community about it, that this was an unnecessary thing. The OSPCA didn't even bother to tell the people with whom they have a business relationship, the town of Markham, the town of Richmond Hill, and the town of Aurora, that they were going to shut their shelter. Animals were still going into that building with a virulent ringworm from communities that were perfectly healthy. They were spaying and neutering in those days with people's pets. So the question is, why go through this particular situation? I think it's put the debate out in the community about euthanasia, and I think it's really good.
You put it out there. Brian, you want to respond to some of that?
Well, our chair, Rob Godfrey, has gone public and stated that there's going to be a complete transparent investigation. An investigator is going to be named next week. Definitely mistakes were made. Protocols weren't followed. And we needed to work better with our community and our relationships with business organizations and other people in the animal welfare community. And we've come out and said that mistakes were made, and we're, you know, hopeful that the investigation is going to give clear insight into what exactly broke down and where we go with that.
Liz, let me just understand, because you said the biggest disaster here was what you called a PR process. You didn't like that.
No, the biggest disaster was that animals died as a result of a terrible PR process that died unnecessarily.
Did they die? I want to make sure I understand. Did they die because of a bad PR process or because of a bad decision to treat ringworm this way?
A bad decision to treat ringworm, and then a bad decision to, as far as the PR went. The minute people knew that these animals were going to die, people were calling. I dealt with people who said that they would gift all kinds of money, they would open up their homes, they would do all sorts of different things. They could not get an answer back, okay, from the shelters. So, you know, the animals were in there. People thought that the animals were dying unnecessarily, and nobody was responding to these generous offers out in the community.
Hanna, again, in your experience, is it typical in the case of ringworm, which I understand is treatable, even if it is virulent, it's treatable, would euthanasia be a typical response if you're running a shelter?
No.
It wouldn't be.
It's not. It's absolutely not. It's not a condition that's causing the animal suffering. I can't speak to the specific strain at Newmarket, and if it was more virulent than what I've experienced at the Toronto Humane Society, then perhaps it was causing more suffering. But no, it's a treatable condition. But I do want to point out that it's not a condition that's easily diagnosed or easily treated. It's not something that, I mean, many animals are going to go asymptomatic, so you're not going to realize that they're carriers and they're going to be spreading it around. So it's very difficult to control. It's also like minimum of a month of treatment, oral antifungal treatments as well as dips. And so it's not something that's a quick, easy fix, like a 1 week course of antibiotics or something. So, I mean, a fungus is tough to treat and diagnose.
Okay.
I think it's important to remember that while it's unusual to euthanize animals for a ringworm outbreak, it's actually the subject of debate largely within shelter medicine. When I started researching this, pretty quickly I came across a recent article in a magazine put out by the American Humane Society. And in the first paragraph, the veterinarian who wrote the column said, you know, the first thing you need to decide is whether you can afford to do this and whether you don't need to euthanize the animals. That the cost to the overall good of the animal community can outweigh the benefit of saving these animals. I'm not going to characterize the OSPCA's decision itself as good or bad. I think it's important that we recognize that there's a lot of debate amongst professionals about this. Equally, actually, I found a lot of online sort of chat rooms with veterinarians where they go back and forth over this.
So there is a big debate about how you actually treat this.
There is a big debate. It's kept under the rug a little bit because the examples I could find, there was sort of an attempt to keep this quiet. You know, this is an unusual scenario, and that the OSPCA at the time that they did this had locked horns with the Toronto Humane Society and was under a microscope. And so I think it was set up to blow up at a different level. Also, as Liz pointed out, there was some PR breakdown there.
But I think beyond that, what I think this points out is exactly the problem with what we have with the OSPCA, and that is that while it is sheltering and managing animals within its own shelter, it's also prosecuting other shelters. And I fail to see under the OSPCA Act what the oversight is for the OSPCA itself. Who investigates? Yes, they called in an independent investigator, but there's no legislation that requires that to happen. The OSPCA is largely an entity unto itself.
So who investigates the investigator?
Exactly. So here we have the OSPCA down prosecuting the THS, likely for all good reasons. I haven't seen all the data, so I don't know. And then a situation blows up in their own shelter. Who investigates them?
Let me find out. Are you in a bit of a conflict in that situation?
Well, no. You know, the OSPCA is a unique creature because unlike your normal charity, our board is mandated under the OSPCA Act. So in order to change anything in the process, it would have to be done through legislation. It would have to be done by the provincial legislature. And so Liz is correct. We not only run shelters, but we also deal with animal welfare in the province. And we take that job very seriously. And to say that we investigate shelters, we certainly look at shelters. We affiliate them.
Okay, stand by, because actually, bring that up again, will you, Michael? Because that was a good couple of questions there. And while Brian has the floor, we should put those to him. Can we bring those up? Why didn't the agencies work together to solve the situation? One of the people who emailed us tonight said, why didn't the OSPCA not accept all the offer of assistance?
The OSPCA was dealing with a dynamic situation, and it relied on the expertise of veterinarians, both in-house and others that they consulted, to make the decisions that were made. And it changed over time, it evolved over time, very caught by surprise by the level of protest, listened to the protesters, had them come into the facility and talk with us.
Kate, based on what you know, did they make the wrong decision there?
I don't know that I'm in a position to say wrong or right decision.
You've talked to others, though, who've looked at this. Is there a consensus out there about whether or not they made the wrong call?
I think definitely in the court of public opinion, absolutely they made the wrong decision. And regardless of what you think of the decision, I think you can clearly say that they probably didn't reach out enough to the public to discuss what they were doing and to discuss what avenues might be available to them.
Liz, the Toronto Humane Society describes itself as a quote-unquote no-kill shelter. What does that mean?
Well, that's a really interesting debate and has caused all sorts of you know, controversy over the years. Largely it means in some people's mind that you literally don't kill any animals, that you allow them to go through the process of dying as we would humans and all that sort of stuff, and you try and mitigate suffering as much as possible. And we know that in large shelters that doesn't work very well, and there's not enough staff to make that all happen properly, and so on and so forth. We run a program called Project Jessie. We rescue 400 animals a year. We kill nobody unless it's involves a terminal cancer that is, you know, can't be fixed, that there's pain, there's no quality of life. All that is assessed. So we do euthanize, but very, very few animals. I think the problem here is that shelters take in too many animals, and so they have to euthanize for cage space. And I know most shelters don't want to talk about it, but it's in fact the case.
What gets euthanized more, cats or dogs?
Oh, cats for sure. Dogs are under control. Largely, there's no problem with dogs at all in Canada. It has turned around in 30 years like I've never seen before. The city, a number of the shelters in the Ontario area are bringing animals in from Ohio and Quebec because they can't find enough dogs to adopt out. Cats are the problem.
Hannah, let me put this to you. We have an email up here that came up, said, of course, if you know, if there's a problem with the health of an animal that has the potential, there it is again, to affect public health must prevail. And if euthanization of animals is required, so be it. Is that the prevailing view within the industry itself?
I don't think so, no. So you're saying a human life is more important than an animal life?
I'm saying this email came in from somebody who's watching our program right now who said, if there is damage to the animal population, humans have to come first. And if there's a potential of pets leaving an SPCA and infecting humans, then human public health has to come first.
Well, on that note, I want to say that in this instance, ringworm is not something that's going to cause suffering to the human. I've had ringworm myself. It's a small patch of, you know, whitened skin that wasn't itchy. I wouldn't have even known I had it unless the clinic said, oh, we had a batch of kittens in here with ringworm. So in that instance, no. It may be if you've got a disease that's with a high mortality and morbidity, that's something else to discuss. But in terms of ringworm, no, I don't think the public health risk was enough to warrant the euthanasia.
Go ahead, you're smiling, Brian.
Yeah, well, I have to disagree with that just on one level. I realize that Hannah's the vet and I'm just the lawyer. But if you have ringworm in a facility and you get that ringworm out of the facility into human beings going into homes, then there's a small child in the home who takes it to daycare, then everybody in daycare gets it. Maybe nobody's dying, but as a shelter, you have a responsibility to the public to ensure that you're not spreading disease within the human population.
Now you're a shelter vet.
I would disagree
hang on
with
one
that,
second.
sure.
Hannah first and then Liz. Go ahead.
Well, on that note, while I was a shelter veterinarian, what we did in cases of ringworm, we would ensure that the animal had 3 negative culture results before it went out for adoption. So I'm not saying in any way that you should be adopting out ringworm animals. You should be very confident that that animal has gotten over the infection before you adopt it out.
Liz?
Well, I think this is exactly the public relations problem. You know, if you look at the way in which the literature the discussions unfolded from the OSPCA, you could see a sea change once people were seen to be having the disease and it leaving the shelter. That's, I think, when the decision was made, it would appear to me, on the euthanasia stuff. And I think that's just wrong-headed, that animals that are in the shelter that have no control over their lives whatsoever are persecuted and killed because 6 people left the shelter with ringworm. And I think that is just too heavy a price to pay, and it isn't warranted.
We just got an email here that I want you to comment on. Liz, I'm warning you ahead of time, you're not going to like it, but I want you to comment on it anyway. We got, one of the emails got put up on the screen a few minutes ago. It said 350 animals in the grand scheme of things is really pretty small. It's not that big a deal if it means saving the population.
Well, in fact, it isn't a big deal because most shelters kill that many animals every year. We kill 625 million animals to eat. So we kill 2 million animals a year in research laboratories. So you want to talk about numbers. In fact, it is not. But this is an OSPCA. This is a shelter that says we care about animals and we're going to kill them because 6 people had ringworm. I think that is a public relations nightmare. It is a terrible thing to do to the animals that have no control over their lives whatsoever. And I think the OSPCA should have gone the distance in this one, reached out to the community and said, please help us. We don't want to kill these animals. We want to find a solution. And that's what I think should happen. But I think the reason it didn't happen is because euthanasia is one of those topics that no shelter wants to talk about. It's hidden. It's the way we clean up our streets. We kill them, we burn them, we remove the problem, so nobody has to talk about it. I think we should kill animals publicly so the politicians know what it's like. Politicians know that what 350 cats dying actually looks like, how many plastic bags there are, how big the bodies are in the cooler while they're waiting for the dead animal pickup. That's what needs to be exposed, because otherwise things are not going to change.
Hanna.
I'm in complete agreement, Liz, and I think that if those numbers were exposed, then municipalities would take the situation more seriously, and they would take into account that the only solution to euthanizing all these animals is to get to the root cause and spay-neuter your animals. And if we spent half the amount of money we do bringing animals into shelters and euthanizing them on sterilizing your animals, then you're getting to the root cause, and these animals' lives are not going to be at risk.
You know, the City of Calgary publishes all their figures on the website. Right up there.
All their figures of what?
All euthanasia, in, out, euthanasia, why they were killed, temperament, old age, whatever. Okay, it's all out there. And that's exactly what should happen with all these shelters.
Let me ask Kate
the only
about
reason
this.
I can get in, the only reason I can get the figures about the OSPCA is because they have a contract with the municipality, and I can do an access to information to that municipality to find out what the euthanasia rates are.
Did you, Kate, in your reporting on this story, discover that euthanasia was a big issue that nobody wanted to talk about because it's kind of, it's the little dirty secret of the business?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
That's absolutely what it is. It's interesting, the Toronto Humane Society, when I started my investigation, had just put out a press release where they had requested the euthanasia numbers from Toronto Animal Services. They actually were in a battle then with Toronto Animal Services, which is run by the city. And they were
just Toronto Animal Services and the Toronto Humane Society are two distinct things?
They're two distinct things. The Toronto Humane Society is an independent charity, and Toronto Animal Services is run by the city. It handles all the city functions. It's the city pound, effectively. So they're slightly different functions. So what the Toronto Humane Society did is they would request their numbers, and they did this regularly, and they'd post their own euthanasia data and compare it to Toronto Animal Services as a way to generate good publicity. They even had their numbers on a billboard outside the building at one point. So it's a really touchy subject. And I think it's interesting that the Toronto Humane Society has sort of managed to come out as one extreme of the spectrum, because I think there are other shelters like Calgary that might be a better thing to uphold as an example of a low kill or a no kill situation. I think there's some allegations and some evidence to suggest that maybe the Toronto Humane Society shouldn't be upheld as one end of the spectrum.
Let me put one example on the table here and then get some opinions about this. There was one dog housed at the Humane Society, Toronto Humane Society, that was a lab pit bull mixed breed named Bandit. I don't know if any of you know the story of Bandit, but apparently he mauled a toddler in 2003, was ordered euthanized in 2004. The THS wouldn't euthanize. They housed Bandit in their shelter, and when the OSPCA raided the shelter, they seized Bandit and euthanized him about a month ago. Should Bandit have been euthanized?
Not entirely accurate.
Not accurate? No?
What happened was, back in 2004, Justice of the Peace made an order that Bandit was to be euthanized after he mauled the 3-year-old boy. The family surrendered Bandit to the Toronto Humane Society, and Tim Tro, the president of the Toronto Humane Society at the time, brought an application in court to stay the execution and then subsequently to appeal the decision that he should be euthanized. That appeal was outstanding all the way up until about a month and a half ago. And the OSPCA had made an arrangement with the Toronto Humane Society as a form of settlement of their dispute, where all the animals would be out of the facility by April 15th, I believe was the date, and the only animal left in the facility was Bandit. Bandit had been in Mr. Tro's office for many years in a private cage he had in his office. And he had actually apparently bit 3 people in the Toronto Humane Society in that 5-year period. It was
Even
there.
though he was in the cage?
Yes. It was not the decision of the OSPCA to euthanize Bandit. That decision was made solely by the Toronto Humane Society. Their executive director, Garth Jerome, made that decision, and in conjunction with veterinarians, which is his obligation, and he was euthanized by the Toronto Humane Society.
But I gather, okay, Hanna, take this one on. I gather, is it possible that under some circumstances it's actually better for the animal to be euthanized rather than, in this case, living in a cage for the rest of his natural life?
Well, just to clarify, in Bandit's situation, because I worked in the shelter and I saw where Bandit lived every day, he actually roamed free in Tim Tro's office. So he wasn't encaged. He actually had a better quality of life than the other dogs at the shelter.
Oh.
But given he was confined to he couldn't leave the Toronto Humane Society premises, so he certainly didn't live the life of a normal dog. The point I want to make is that when you ask was Bandit's euthanasia warranted, I would say no, because Bandit was not given any behavior modification training. He was not worked with by experts behaviorists. He was basically ignored and thrown in Tim's office. So it was an unfair situation for him.
How did the dog manage to roam around in Tim's office and never bite Tim? Or did it bite Tim?
You know what? He wasn't always an aggressive dog. But he was unpredictably aggressive, and in many instances he showed his aggression, and he injured people and other animals. So,
you got a view on this, Liz?
Yeah, I actually agree that, and I think the problem is that Bandit became the icon of this big fight over pit bull issues. And over aggression. And I would just say that there's a cautionary tale. I talked to an individual who rescued a dog that was taken into the shelter for euthanasia because it growled and bit somebody. And upon investigation, they found that this dog had been picked up by its fur and thrown against a wall, and the person who did that got bitten. But none of that was reported. It was seen as an aggressive dog. So I think the difficulty...
Do you think that goes towards explaining perhaps why the dog did what it did?
Well, that's right. So there may be, largely when these aggressive situations happen, extenuating circumstances are not always investigated to find out why it occurred. There's a fear reaction that occurs and an immediate desire to get rid of that animal. And Bandit became an icon of all those fights caught in the middle of the Humane Society. I never saw him there. I don't know what kind of life he lived. I'm clearly not a normal dog life, which is very, very sad to me. And seeing the pictures in the Globe and Mail of Bandit made me extremely sad, because ultimately this animal paid with his life for a fight that he had no control over or anything to say about. He was just there, a pawn amongst all these people who had opinions about what should happen to him.
Kate, I'm going to go to you with this. One of the things that all of this has exposed are some pretty serious turf wars among the differing organizations out there that say that they are responsible for animal welfare in this province and country. Can you go into that a bit? What did you discover on that front?
Well, as soon as you become at all acquainted with the animal welfare world, you learn about the positions of the Toronto Humane Society and the OSPCA and Toronto Animal Services, other large shelters in the country. They all have kind of staked out a position on that spectrum, largely based on how they euthanize. It's really the sort of flag that a shelter will put in the sand to say, this is our position, give us your dollars. The turf war between the OSPCA and the Toronto Humane Society began a long time ago. The Toronto Humane Society actually sued the Hamilton SPCA a few years ago for libel over donation flyers, seeking donations.